Now it's time for today's perspective. Well, my guest on the programme today proudly says that writing his latest book, The Soul, A History of the Human Mind, certainly changed his life, and that reading it may also change yours as well. Now, The Soul aims to show how belief in the soul and beliefs arising from the soul or mind have animated and driven our history. Now, its author is Paul Ham, an Australian who spends his time between Sydney and mostly now here in Paris. He's a man who has written 14 books as he aims to listen to the civilian victims of atrocities as well in many of them. He's also been, in his time, editor of Amnesty International's British Journal, as well as a financial journalist and a foreign correspondent as well. And he joins me now here on set. Thanks ever so much for coming in and talking.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with the latest book, first of all, The Soul, A History of the Human Mind. I mean, looking into this and looking into a bit you, I mean, it seems like your whole life has been building up to this book. Is that true, do you think?
Absolutely, yeah. This was the culmination, really, of my previous books. I couldn't have written it without them. And they demonstrated to me, actually, I wrote myself into a fairly dark place with my previous histories. They were histories of war and conflict and ideas that led to conflict. And I was starting to think that, do we live in this Hobbesian world, after the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, that we're forever destined to, bash each other's brains out and we're never going to see some kind of respite from that? And writing The Soul turned me really into a long-run optimist. I found that really there are ways that we can transcend that idea of eternal conflict.
That's interesting that you feel much more optimistic. I mean, sometimes, particularly when you watch news channels like ours, you sort of feel a little bit depressed and very pessimistic. Why did it make you an optimist?
I say a long-run optimist, and having written histories of the causes of World War I, the Pacific War, the Vietnam War, and I wrote a history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, I come from, as a historian, a fairly dark place, plus histories of the Reformation. And what I found was that this is not inevitable. That the realists today would say that the conflict is inevitable. And my research in The Soul showed that there were countless occasions in human history where that is simply not the case. The Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, demonstrated that Catholics and Protestants could live together in the same village without destroying each other. And that peace has sort of lasted since 1648, give or take a few, flashes in the Northern Ireland, for example. But by and large, we don't imagine that Protestants and Catholics are going to start going to war again over the nature of a wafer. And that people don't really look at the good stories in the past because war is more interesting, perhaps, or why we fight against each other. But there are many other moments
similar stories. Why The Soul, though? I mean, in a few simple sentences, is it possible to say what the soul is?
No, because every society, every culture has a different conception or has at least some idea of what the soul is, and they vary through time. The simple idea behind this book is really to narrate how societies and ancient cultures leading through to the present time have interpreted the soul, or the spirit, the self. Freud would call it the ego, the consciousness, the conscience, what we should or shouldn't do. And my book really is to show how those societies have interpreted the soul, defined the soul, sought to enslave it, convert it, love it, befriend it, convert it to their own idea of what the soul should be, such as the conquests of the new world. So that's really the conception behind the book. I don't presume to define what is ineffable, what no one has been able to define, not the neuroscientists, not the psychologists. But the things we're prepared to do in the name of the soul's salvation, or the soul's conversion, are bloody, are horrible, or they're extraordinarily loving. And that's the theme of the book.
Oh, do we talk about the soul as much as we used to, do you think? I mean, maybe if you're particularly religious or spiritual, you do, but a lot of people perhaps don't really talk about the soul anymore.
Well, I suppose the wellness and well-being industry has converted the soul into a spiritual ideal. But the great religions still, of course, every Sunday talk about the salvation of the soul in some form. And that idea of heaven and hell, that the afterlife is an extraordinary idea. I mean, it brought down the Roman Empire, essentially, the idea that there was something beyond death which was good, was possibly good, it could be terrible. But that Christian idea of salvation was a very immensely powerful concept. And that history, one of my driving forces, I suppose, is to understand what motivates historical events. And you could argue conflict, economic, struggle over scarce resources, all kinds of ideas, the great man theory of history. I actually think that one of the key drivers of history is our beliefs in a prophecy, in a promised land, in some kind of political utopia, in an unrealizable ideal. But the things we're prepared to do to reach that ideal, the drivers of the soul, are harrowing, are terrifying, but also extraordinarily moving and inspiring.
I talked at the beginning about how the book has been a bit of a culmination of your work. A lot of your other books are more specific, aren't they? Talking about individual moments in history. Yeah. There are books about atomic bombings, written about the First World War, early years of Hitler, Vietnam. Why did you pick all those subjects, and how have they all come together, or are they more separate and they've come together in this?
I didn't write them with a view to writing this. This emerged, this evolved in my mind over the past 25, 30 years. But as a historian, I've always alighted on subjects where I feel there's something missing. We don't understand this. We're trying to understand this, and there's something missing here. I wrote a history of the atomic bomb, which dismantles the received wisdom of the last 70, 80 years. It's the 80th anniversary this year. The idea that the bomb was absolutely necessary, that it was our least abhorrent choice, that it saved 1 million American servicemen. This is pure post-war propaganda, and the book really analyzes day to day what led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these histories, particularly my history of the Vietnam War, told through the Australian experience, but hadn't really been written in full before, showed just what extent. My question always is why people did this to each other. What drove them to inflict this sort of extraordinary pain upon each other for so long, and particularly in the Vietnam case, and those questions led me to belief as an engine of history.
Yeah, it's fascinating where it comes from, isn't it? It's a question I often ask of authors: where does this come from in you? What was it that in your childhood, perhaps even, that set you off? Do you think in this course?
Well, I think that I've been fascinated by the afterlife, the idea of an afterlife, whether it be the ancient Greek or Roman afterlife, which as a boy I was always reading, about the underworld, and I was intrigued by the Odyssey, the story of the Odyssey, which when I was a kid there were, the children's versions of that, and I was always intrigued about what happens after death, and the questions we ask as children are never answered. And yet they're the most profound questions. Who am I? What happens to me when I die? And no one can answer them. And yet the most profound philosophers still grapple with those questions. I conclude with the book is thinking, why don't we spend more time actually thinking about this life than the mirage of the next? And maybe we might together construct a world in which we're all happy to live on without being driven by this urge to destroy one another. And it's that ideal that I think the consciousness, our psyches are in the foothills of their development. That's another reason why I emerged an optimist. So 5,000 years ago, the conscience first started speaking to us, saying, no, thou shalt not do that. You can do that. I mean, actually, our little internal policeman or policewoman telling us what we should and shouldn't do. The conscience is an extraordinarily recent phenomenon. And so the mind is really in the foothills of its evolutionary development. That gives me a great source of hope, even against artificial intelligence, that we're an evolving species. And I think that we will ultimately settle down to look at this beautiful planet we live in and try to think about this life rather than this possibly beautiful, possibly hideous mirage of what happens when we cross over to the other side.
Perfect to end on a really nice, optimistic note. Thanks very much for coming in.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
To us. Paul Ham, there's the book, The Soul, A History of Human Mind, and good to have you on the programme today. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Now, we were going to bring you our focus report on the programme now, and Focus today is taking